Hello and welcome to a Conquest the Last Argument of Kings event recap. This is going to be two games played at a local event we ran yesterday, and I played the Old Dominion. This is going to be a quick recap style, so I will go through the list that I played and some concepts I was looking to test, and then two games, one against city-states and one against the 100 Kingdoms. So on screen now is just a quick recap of the list. This is pulled out of the Conquest Army Builder, and this is a Xhiliarch Warlord list. What I'm experimenting with this in particular is to try and see exactly how many heavies I can push into an Old Dominion list, and whether there is like a critical mass that either overperforms or begins to fall behind on scenario. The games that I played, I wouldn't say were conclusive tests, but they did get to showcase some of both the strengths and the weaknesses of the list. In terms of the character loadouts and equipments, we're running relatively light here. So the Xhiliarch is our most equipped character. He has no retinue, but he does have Calamitas, the Gladiator Dark Blessing, and the Aventine armor, so he'll give his regiment hardened, and he personally will have 6 attacks, cleave 2, deadly blades, flurry, and parry. So he's not completely juiced, but he's a very powerful duelist and a very dangerous addition to his warband. After this, we have a minimum just tax unit of Legionnaires, who I hope to die and generate dark power. We then have a big unit of Praetorian Guard, no Profane Sepulchre. There's only one Aura of Death in this list, but they do have a Standard Bearer, and there are 5 of them. We then have 2 units of Varangian Guard, both upsized to 4. That's basically all of the Varangian Guard that I own, with standards. We then have an Archimandrite with no equipment whatsoever, again in a completely minimum, just somewhere to put the Archimandrite support unit of Legionnaires, and a unit of 4 Bone Golems. Then a Hierodeacon. I had 10 spare points after everything else, so rather than having Arcane Retinue 1, it has the Consecrated Mitre. So what this means is that the Hierodeacon can transform into kind of a blaster as the game progresses. The Hierodeacon already gives you a little bit of interesting dark power payoff because its Black Flame Coruscation spell gets +1 automatic hit if it succeeds for every level of dark power, and so by adding in the Consecrated Mitre, that means you can eventually get to a point where the Hierodeacon is something like, for example, a Priest 9, and if it succeeds on its attack, it does +4 automatic hits. Now, we never reach that at any point this game, but it is like just interesting that you can reach that high by spending an extra 10 points over Arcane Retinue 1. Again, minimum unit of Legionnaires, and then a unit of Canephors. So we have 4 heavy regiments in this list, and I want to say 4 light regiments. 8 regiments total, 11 activations, which is, for an Old Dominion list, probably a little bit on the heavy side, but only a little. It's a bit activation dense. But yeah, I thought this would be an interesting list, and specifically what I'm trying is, I can't realistically fit more heavies into the list than this. Maybe when cultists come out, you could squeeze one more stand in, but the only way you would otherwise get more heavies is by downgrading the Praetorian Guard unit, which I'm not willing to do. And so that's it, basically. This is the maximum amount of heavies that I can fit in an OD list, and I wanted to see, does it work? Obviously, with 2 of the heavy regiments being Varangian Guard in the Xhiliarch Warband's list, there's also a lot of potential threat. In terms of the Xhiliarch's Warband, these Legionnaires are not going to do a great deal of damage, but with the Xhiliarch embedded in the Praetorians and then 2 units of Varangian, you have potentially a lot of hitting power on his Supremacy turn. So yeah, not a lot of ranged. We've got some spellcasting from the Archimandrite and the Hierodeacon, and that's it. But plenty of threat range, plenty of power, and a lot of staying power. Varangian Guard are tough, Praetorian Guards are tough, Bone Golems are tough, and Canephors are tough. So this list, once this list connects, it can really grind out a fight, and it just needs to not fall horrifically behind on scenario. So with that dark portent advised, our first scenario is grind them down against city-states. And this is probably close to the worst case scenario, not necessarily in terms of the faction matchup. I think Old Dominion match up quite well into city-states, even a city-states list like the one that I would be playing against. But this is a short table edge scenario. So we are deploying over here and the city-states are deploying over here, which means that there is 72 inches in between the two armies. I'm not even going to start deploying anything until turn 2, and indeed this picture here is taken at the beginning of turn 2. There is going to be 3 or 4 turns before any contact between the armies is made, and because my opponent has light scoring units, they will be able to potentially get a big scenario lead. I'll introduce my opponent's units as they turn up, but the first unit which turned up, and this is proxied, the first unit that turned up is this unit of, I think, Thorakides, are the light fluid formation unit, and they've turned up and they have Vanguard March 15 inches onto the battlefield, bringing their Thyrian, but more importantly, their medium Aristarch with them. So this unit is not just going to be scoring, it's also going to be setting a reinforcement line and moving very, very quickly toward the central objective. On top of this unit, my opponent has at least one unit of Haspists, so the scoring will quickly begin to tilt in my opponent's favour. Now, I've forgotten to take a picture of turn 3, but on turn 3, so from turn 2 to turn 3, this unit will move up to here, and a unit of Haspists will move up here, and a unit of Hoplites will move up behind the Thorakides. So starting on turn 2, my opponent scores 2 points, and then at the end of turn 2, at the end of turn 3, he scores another 6. So at the end of turn 3, there's already 8 points for my opponent, and none for me, because on turn 2, basically my Praetorian Guard move up to here, and then they move up to here on turn 3 rather. So it isn't until turn 3 that I get 2 points on the board. So basically we can already see the scenario lead slipping away from me, and I'm going to have to rely on the strength of my list to recover through basically a big sustained fight. So this is how things look at the end of turn 3, beginning of turn 4, and we are starting to see the battlefield be shaped. So these hoplites have marched on here, the Haspists have moved up and then moved up again, so we've got these Haspists here. This is a unit of Agema. So Agema mirrors to the Thorakides. They are a fluid formation melee unit. The difference between Agema and Thorakides is that Thorakides get their Thyrian, which is an excellent auxiliary with cleave and linebreaker, etc. But the Agema just have natively really good stats. They are absolute punchers. Both units have the attachment that lets them flurry if they come off the strategic stack, and both characters, we have a Warlord Polemark in the Agema, have the Architects of the Cities Retinue 3, which means they'll also get impact attacks too if they come off the strategic stack. Now that wouldn't come into play this turn, or this game even, but the flurry would matter, and just the sheer quality of the Agema would let them fight into troops that normally city-states would struggle to deal with. We also have both a Hephaestian and a Promethean who have turned up, this being end of turn 3, beginning of turn 4. They've marched onto the table, and all that's left for my opponent to bring on at this point, I believe, is one unit, an outsized unit of 4 Thyrians. So for my part, I am aware that I'm going to have to split my army, basically. My goal is to score both of these objectives basically continuously throughout the game. I'm going to fall far too far behind if I don't. But what I want is basically a big mosh happening here. I want to bring lots and lots of sustained melee fighting against my opponent, because I think that I am probably a little stronger than they are, despite the fact that their army is all melee and my army is actually not quite all melee with the spellcasting priests. I think I can win that fight. For my opponent's part, what he probably needs to do is set the scoring line here early, even potentially push me off, basically stop me from getting into this objective for multiple turns, and then basically do a fighting retreat. Just hold this for long enough that I can't get anything resembling a scoring lead, and after that, just set the lines of engagement in front of these two objectives and grind me out. The scenario is called grind them down, grind me out of the scenario. Instead, what is going to happen is that my opponent will actually accept the fight that I want to take, and I think as a result, we're going to see basically some city-state advantaged engagements. In terms of how my troops are moving up, we have these Praetorian guards, and they are setting a reinforcement line that I fully intend to use. And then we have Legionnaires turning up elsewhere. So we have a little unit of 3 Legionnaires here. This is the unit with no priest in it. And then we have an Archimandrite here and a Hierodeacon here. This unit is going to be doing the thing that you'll sometimes see an Archimandrite and Hierodeacon do, which is that the Hierodeacon will be using her draw event to kill a stand, and then the Archimandrite will be using a heal spell to put that stand back, and rinse and repeat multiple times. That is one of the few advantages that I'm going to have in this scenario, is that just the fact that it's going to take until turn 4 for anyone to even be fighting, even a slim engagement, gives me some time to build up some dark power reserves. It's not quite showing in the photo, but we've also got my first heavy unit coming on here. Everything else failed this turn in the Varangian Guard. I am basically relying on the Varangian Guard to kind of like hold this position here. This obstruction, I think, is going to be a little painful for me. I'm going to have to use it in some capacity to shelter my flanks. I would much rather engage basically across this entire space, because I have lots and lots of melee. But then again, so does my opponent, but they can concentrate it around the giants. So The Varangian Guard will be moving up here, and I'm going to have to use reinforcement lines to bring troops on here and here. One of the small advantages of not having heavies turn up, basically apart from the Varangians, on turn 3 is that on turn 4 they can at least use the reinforcement lines to arrive. So jumping ahead to the end of turn 4, beginning of turn 5, and yeah, you can see there has still not been any fighting happening, but everything is on the field now. These Tharians have come in off the reinforcement line here, the Giants have moved up to these positions, and the Thorakides and Agema are posturing. If it looks like these Haspis have turned around, it's because they have. With the Agema now in this position ready to move up here, the Haspis actually have to come back around and basically sit on this objective for the rest of the game. That's going to be necessary for my opponent to score, and that's fine. That's what Haspis are really good at, is just moving quickly to objectives and then holding them. He'd postured them forward initially just in case anything sneaky happened, and now they were coming back. So in terms of the fighting power of the two lists, the Tharians are projecting threat in here, the Thorakides rather are projecting threat here, and then we have the Giants and the Agema. So most of what my opponent is sort of posturing is he's building kind of like a line that can engage there, although because these are fluid formation units, they threat a long way. The Agema could easily turn and move this direction, and the Thorakides basically could fight wherever it is that they want to, and so I'm going to have to engage into that. For my part, I'm a little bottlenecked. These two Legionnaire units and then this Legionnaire unit with no priest in it aren't really going to contribute to these fights particularly much. One of them will eventually get into combat, but that's not really the goal. Instead, we've got the Varangians coming on here. We don't have the Canephora having arrived yet, but we've got this big mess of heavies here. The Bone Golems had to walk on 2 abreast in order to actually get off the reinforcement line, and the Varangians had to come on 3 abreast with 1 reserve. So like this is a lot of force, but my onus is going to be to actually spread that force out and not have it stuck here. Kind of the worst thing that could happen would be something like these Thorakides, like fluid formation, moving and then charging to like this position here. Realistically, it's unlikely that they would do that because I could actually counterattack them with Legionnaires. But if they did that, and then the 2 Giants basically just yeeted forward like this and engaged the Praetorian block there and there, the Giants probably will win that fight, but more importantly, they would pin my entire army back. But to do that would require near perfect tactical coordination from my opponent, and of course I'm going to attempt to disrupt that. We are both sort of talking about how the game state is at this point, and this really is the decisive sort of like there's a decisive moment brewing here where we have the Thorakides. They can definitely charge the Praetorians if they want to because of fluid formation. They will reform into sort of this position so that there's a very narrow gap between the 2 units. But if they do that before I activate, yes, they will. I mean, I've got 2 stands. This objective I think is a 12-inch one. So he's got 1 medium stand here. I've got 2 medium stands here. I actually scored this zone, I think, at the end of this turn, end of turn 4. I actually scored this zone, which helped a little bit with the scenario lead. Basically, if he runs into me, he will do some damage, but these are hardened Praetorians. He's not likely to kill them, and if I am able to commit forward, then I have the potential to sort of like jump into the zone. So we're in kind of like a everything to play for situation, and as we roll into the next turn, what is going to happen is that I'm going to force my opponent's hand. And in particular, I believe we are very close to me declaring supremacy, or if nothing else, he wins the roll, and so he has to make a decision before he knows whether or not I win supremacy. And with that decision made, he chooses to commit. Now, I haven't supremacied this turn. The Varangian are still too far from the battlefield. I want them to be able to either march, charge, clash, or ideally charge, clash, clash. But he has come in, and he's come in with both the Hephaestian, but the Hephaestian has had to march, charge. The main thing that happened is that the Thorakides have come in first. And they've kind of bounced. They didn't come off the strategic stack. Instead, they just made the rush before they could be engaged themselves. And so they haven't had, the only impact attacks they've had are from the Tharian, which Hardened has, easily taken care of. And then they've made a whole bunch of attacks, but again, there's no cleave apart from the Tharian itself, the auxiliary. There are flawless strikes from the Aristarch, but that only goes so far. And they have done some damage. From the looks of it, they've killed, I think, maybe one stand of Praetorians and wounded another. It looks like some wound markers there. But between that and just the march charge for some impact attacks from the Hephaestian, who's attempted to cast a spell but hasn't had nearly enough dice to push the spell through interference from the Hierodeacon back here. Basically, this unit is totally fine. And on the crackback, they have smashed up these Thorakides. Now, we are otherwise still posturing, and my opponent does handily score the zone this turn because we've got 3 scoring here and 3 scoring here. Even with the Thorakida unit broken, these two giants are a ton of scoring strength. But this has invited the fight that I wanted, and we are doing some posturing now. This distance here is also going to be incredibly awkward for my opponent. This is going to be something like 10 inches, and the Tharians therefore have either a non-rerollable 4+ charge clash or a march charge. Whereas for my part, I could take the 4+ rerollable unstoppable with the bone golems. These formations are quite unfortunate. I'm 2 abreast and he's 4 abreast, but if I make that and clash into him, it's going to be very bad for the Tharians. We're also posturing the Varangians here, and what's important, a little bit of important positioning here, is that they've moved far enough forward that they can charge around this and move in this direction. Basically, if they wheel around there, they'll have a straight line run into the flank of the Hephaestion. We've also finally brought the Canephors on here, and this is basically, they've come on behind the Varangians so that they can either move over to shield against the Agema, or if the Varangians move this direction, they can push down this flank and potentially, eventually, engage this unit of cows that's moving around onto this objective. So if we jump ahead, we can see that the decisive action has occurred. It might actually be easier to go back to the last turn and talk through what happened here, because there are obviously far, far, far fewer city-state troops left on the field at this point. So if we jump back to here, this was, I want to say, end of turn 5 or end of turn, I think this was end of turn 6, beginning of turn 7. So we're just getting engaged at this juncture. I'm going to use the Xhiliarch Supremacy at the beginning of turn 6. And my opponent activates the Tharians first, and as I mentioned, we have this very awkward engagement range here, where he has to choose what to do. And he actually activates the Tharians first, and he goes for the roll, and he rolls a 3, and he whiffs it. And that's basically, that is terrible. He could have chosen to march charge, and that might have been better, but ultimately this posture was just bad for him. So instead, he moves up, he fails the charge, and much, much later in the turn, I'm going to have the Bone Golem slam into this unit and completely annihilate it. And that is just, that's catastrophic, and things are going to kind of get worse from there. One good thing that happens with the Varangians, I decide not to go into the Hephaestion. I figure I have enough power to kill it in any case. And so the Varangians march charge clash. They hit the Agema, and they do some damage, but on the crackback, Agema, coming off the strategic stack with Flurry, will delete, almost delete the unit. Not a lot of things can one-round a unit of Varangians, but these Agema are proper fighters, and so despite the casualties, this is a fight that's going well in their way. In the center, the Promethean has come in, and so we saw it's sort of going to be engaged here. I think it had to march charge, and so it's tried to impact and do its spell. It's failed, and then we've activated I think the Hephaestion actually has a crack as well, and there's a fair bit of damage that happens here. But ultimately, what goes on is that all of these forces commit, and I get 2 clashes with this unit. And thanks to the Xhiliarch's attacks in particular, we actually kill the Promethean, wipe out the Thorakides, and retreat. And by retreating, we let the Varangian Guard move up around and so march, charge, clash, and annihilate the Hephaestion in concert with a charge from these Legionnaires here. So after all of this damage has been done, we've killed. Basically, this has been a decisive turn. The Therians are dead, both giants are dead, the Thorakides are dead, and although the Agema are winning this fight against the Varangian Guard, they are not enough to turn the tide by themselves. So if we jump ahead, we can now basically see this game state. And yes, look, these Agema, there are 3 Agema and the Polmark left. This is a fine fighting force by itself. They've got Army of Lions, and they have all of the benefits of the Agema, but they're going to have to take a turn to destroy the Varangians, which they do, and then they are staring down the barrel of a unit of Canephora that can use Blessed, a unit of Varangians that can hit either the flank or the front. The Praetorians themselves will have wheeled back around and moved back into this position, ready to claim the zone alongside the Hierodeacon, and I've never had to give up scoring here. My opponent is still scoring all of these, but at the end of this turn, basically, we're going to have a situation where these guys, the hoplites, are going to sort of form up here, and I'm just going to run into them. I'm just going to march charge into them with the bone golems, and then I'm going to have 4 stands on an objective, and my opponent will have 3. And at this point, even though this is very late in the game, I think it's almost turn 9 by the time I actually formally contest this. The game at this juncture is done. I've had too many turns of scoring the center zone. I've seized this zone. I've consistently been scoring these two zones. And the last fight over here is probably going to result in my opponent eventually being tabled to the point that we actually just kind of math it out because it's easier to do the numbers at this point, even if I don't come into this fight and take on these Haspests. So ultimately, this was a game that went my way down to it took until about turn 8 for the scoring to flip in my direction, but the strength of the units that I was fielding, the power of bone golems, the power of Varangian guards, the power of those Praetorians with the Xhiliarch, etc., ultimately was able to crush through and win this game. But I think there's a very real argument that this could have gone a different way if my opponent had played it differently. And I think what should probably have changed, if we're being sort of like being kind of brutal about this, is the Thorakides coming up here. In retrospect, if we look at how the table is laid out, probably it was correct. Ultimately, the journey of the Thorakides wants to take them in toward the center where they can begin scoring. But I think the Agema should have been more disciplined in pushing up this flank, and specifically have tried to engineer a breakthrough. Now, I had the Canephora uncommitted, maybe that would not have happened, but if the lines of battle are drawn here, and the Varangian guard are kept pinned in this place, and so the Canephora kind of have to stay here and struggle around. What that means is that even if the Agema eventually lose, and they do probably eventually lose that fight, the fight happens here, which means that there is no way, basically, it's going to be very, very difficult for me to ever actually make it all the way through these lines and seize this objective. So that takes care of this zone. The hoplites up here are fine doing the same thing. And that leaves the Thorakides, basically. What do they do? And what the Thorakides, I think, want to do is basically be either more or less committal. They've got two options there. So option one is they fight kind of to a draw, where the two giants and the Thorakides posture in this space here and try and just force me into a situation where I have to heavily commit to the zone. Because if we think about how those giants can position, right, we have the central zone here. It's about here, like in this kind of space. With the two giants, you could position them there, and that is 6 stands in this zone. And then you could potentially have the Thorakides like that, for example. And then you've got seven scoring stands in the zone. That alone is more than the entire unit of Praetorians, and you can do it from the extreme edge of the zone. You're not hidebound by geometry, and if you have the Agema kind of swinging in this way, they could potentially occupy that space. And so what you want to do, I think, as city-states in this situation, is recognize that you're not going to win a grind or even a decisive, against a Xhiliarch army, against an Old Dominion army led by a Xhiliarch, you are not going to win if you charge in for a decisive clash. The power of the Xhiliarch supremacy is too strong if you invite melee. You have to force the Xhiliarch player to take uncomfortable march charge clashes with their combat group in order to basically blunt the power of what would otherwise be a charge clash. And if the city-states player can just draw the game out for 2 more turns with posturing in this center, just scoring for a couple of those, while they score here and maybe the Agema push in this direction, then suddenly there is a position where, yeah, I still get that decisive fight. The game is 10 turns long. You can't stop this tide from cresting over the battlefield forever. But if you can stop the decisive fight in this kind of a scenario from happening until turn 6 or 7 or 8, you could conceivably have done that with sufficient use of these resources. Then the breakthrough never happens, I never get to this objective, and I don't score this objective enough to recover that early scenario lead. So I think in terms of testing this list, the sheer power of all of the heavies is really, really strong. Even in this scenario where I have to just grind my way up the field and hope for my opponent basically engaging me on my terms, the sheer hitting power of this has just about annihilated the city-states army, and by the end of it, the casualties I had taken were down to some Praetorians and a unit of Varangians. I had very close to 1,700 points left on the board at the end of this, and when my opponent had none. And that speaks to how powerful this army can be if it's allowed to wind up and spring the punch. But I think there was a path to victory my opponent could have taken. It just required recognizing it in advance and a lot of discipline, and that's not easy. We're all still pretty new in Canberra where I'm playing. And in this case, for example, example, my opponent has been playing city-states with the hoplites and the phalanxes, and they're quite static and they're quite disciplined. And he wanted to play an army that was more aggressive and that could reach out and throw a punch. And it's just really unfortunate for him that that switch led him into a strategic decision, which was exactly the wrong thing to do in this scenario. So overall, I think this was a very interesting game. It was a decisive victory for the Old Dominion, but it did showcase that there, on this kind of scenario at least, there is a path to victory even against kind of this power. And that is for an army that had no range presence whatsoever. As soon as you add in the ability to concentrate force a little bit more for city-states, that means, for example, the chariots, but any faction with like marksman clones or longbows or Dwegom sorcery, I think the pressure on me to commit in that awkward way, using the Xhiliarch's feat for threat extension, helps swing things even further. I would not, for example, want to play against Dwegom in this scenario, and I'm actually honestly, given how long it took this fight to actually occur, kind of glad that these scenarios are going the way of the dodo in the next scenario pack. Anyway, this was a win. It was a decisive win, which carries us on into round 2 against the 100 Kingdoms. So this game we are playing against Thanquol, who is one of the Goonhammer authors. I write for that site occasionally, and Thanquol writes for that site a lot, and he is playing his 100 Kingdoms. The list that he's running, you won't see all of them just yet, but this is a heavy cavalry list. So we are kind of matching strengths to an extent here. His list consists of a big Gilded Legion block with a Warlord Imperial Officer, a relatively large, you can see them there, Militia block with a completely juiced up Priest. In particular, we have the Elysian Fragment here, and these are all Support 3 Militia from the Relentless Drill army-wide ability. Minimum unit of Militia, I think this is from the Imperial Officer's Warband. And then basically the whole rest of the list is a huge Crimson Tower Priory Commander warband. So we have, there's like no upgrades anywhere, but it's the Crimson Tower Priory Commander, 2 units of 4 or 3 Ashen Dawn, and 2 units of Crimson Tower. Now, Thanquol does not like Crimson Tower Knights, even though they are honestly, in some respects, just more dangerous Cataphractoi in terms of their raw offensive stats. They are surprisingly difficult to support in 100 Kingdoms. And we would talk about this after the game, because Cataphractoi are hugely fearsome cavalry. But what is the difference? The difference between Cataphractoi and Crimson Tower is the context in which they fight. Every single Old Dominion unit is at least a passable anvil unit. Legionnaires always take... Legionnaires are not tough, but even they take like just one more fight than you want to destroy them and move on. Whereas if you think about the units that are available to 100 Kingdoms, they have very cheap chaff. They have 90 and 75 point chaff units. But those units are hugely unreliable, and so it's very difficult to have things like Knights of the Crimson Tower be able to comfortably posture to attack and then deliver a devastating charge, because you can never be completely sure that your screen won't fold and things will push through to the Crimson Tower themselves. That said, I like a lot of what this list is doing. Ashen Dawn are just absolute freaking beaters. They're just hugely powerful, and the Gilded Legion block is massive. So there is a ton of force coming out of this list. 2 units of Ashen Dawn, 1 unit of Gilded Legion, 2 units of Crimson Tower. It's a ton of heavies. I think probably the best thing about the Crimson Tower in this particular list is that if you want them to, you can have the Ashen Dawn just like run into combat and the Crimson Tower come up behind them, because unlike everything I've said about Militia, old Ashen Dawn will hold. In any case, the scenario we're playing here is off balance. So we have 2 12-inch objective zones, and then there are 4 objectives themselves that need to be destroyed, 2 there and 2 there. Each of us is trying to get to the objectives on the far side of the table and destroy them while contesting the objective zones. In my experience, it is pretty rare that those objectives are killed. Every now and again, you'll have a breakthrough that happens, and someone will score kind of like the 4 points for going after these. But most of the time, these are fights across the center line. This scenario tends to play out as fights over these big scenario zones, and that's the bulk of what happens. And it's an interesting scenario because those zones are far enough apart that you really do have 2 discrete flanks that are happening. So turn 1, all of Thanquol stuff has turned up. We have the Priest moving forward, and again it's got something like 18 inches of movement with a Servite in those Militia. It's a long way up, and then next turn it will comfortably be able to score this zone, and the Militia have moved up behind it. So jumping forward to end of round 3, in a change from last game, every single every single medium reserve roll succeeded, which something I was not expecting, but is really, really nice when it happens. So bearing in mind that the entire rest of Thanquil's list is heavy, this militia presence is presently all he has on the table. And so he's just reformed to fight in a slightly wider line. The priest has postured forward, staying outside of range of a few different things, and then all of my stuff has moved forward. You can't see them in this picture, but there is a unit of Legionnaires moving up in this direction. It is the pleb unit of Legionnaires with nothing in it. Then we have the 2 priest unit of Legionnaires. Hierodeacon is there, Archimandrite is there, and you can see 2 wounds on this regiment because once again I have killed a stand and then restored it back. And then we have the Praetorians moving up to fight here. Kind of nothing in my list really wants to fight the Elysium Fragment unit if I can't get the jump on it, but of everything, hardened and lots of wounds at the cheap makes the Praetorians the best ones for it. So I'm optimistically hoping for a situation where maybe I can wear this regiment down, or like, you know, kill it or duel out the priest or something before they manage to Elysium Fragment and bomb me. But it has to be the Praetorians, basically. I don't want to put Varangians into this unit. That would be a massive overkill. I don't want to definitely want to put Bone Golems into this regiment because they have evasion 0. So Praetorians it is. Moving ahead again, this is the end of turn 3, and basically everything has arrived on the field at this point. All that is missing, a single unit of Canephors have not yet arrived, and a unit of Crimson Tower haven't arrived. And so we can see the battlefield begin to shape itself here. The militia have fallen back into a column formation now that Thanquil has seen how wide my Praetorians are fighting. I've flung a few spells into the unit because it's devout from the priest, even with interference. The Unholy Blasphemy from the Archimandrite has done a little bit of damage. But mostly what we have happening here is that the heavies have arrived, and 2 flanks have formed up. So we have, fighting again in column, a massive unit of Gilded Legion, and this is something that the Gilded Legion can do when you have the Relentless Drill army-wide ability. These things are good clash, good cleave, and they are support 3, so they lose very little from fighting in this depth. And on the off chance that I move in with, like, this wide unit of Praetorians, or even the Varangians here, which have moved on. They've moved on 3 wide and 2 deep, with the 4 units in it, 4 stands in the regiment. I'm not going to really be able to engage these 4 wide because there's just not quite enough space on the edge of the table here. Now, if this unit ever wants to wheel, it's going to have to do so very, very slowly, but it's looking to push down in this direction and basically force me into it, have a big fight where it can leverage its numbers. We also have the 2 units of Ashen Dawn having arrived. One is here and one is here, and then there are Crimson Tower here, and the last unit of Crimson Tower will turn up here next turn. So I've made a bit of a gambit here. I have brought on Varangians on either flank, coming on behind these Legionnaires, and Praetorians here, and the Bone Golems have moved on here. Now the Bone Golems are my fastest unit I currently have on the table, and the idea with them is that they can either posture in this direction or in this direction, depending on what I think I can win. If things go horribly wrong, I can have the Bone Golems move to reinforce this flank, but what I'm hoping to do actually is have them come around here. And so all of this said means that I am planning to win the game over here. And if you think about how many points, like this force here is 3/4 of my opponent's army. What I am hoping is just to hold them in place, and ideally no side commits. If nothing happens here for multiple turns, I would be very happy. I expect that's not going to be the case, but the threat of the Xhiliarch I know is messing with Thanquil's head. He's running an all-cavalry army, it's like long threat ranges, and the fact that if I want to, I can out-threat him. Like, he can't reliably charge clash me because he's rolling movement 7, that's it. I can go march, charge, clash, and I can go considerably further. I have unstoppable on all of my stuff. Basically, the threat here is very challenging for him to mentally engage with because he is out-threatened on the turn I use my supremacy. On the turn that happens, he is at great risk. So this is the end of turn 3. Let's jump forward. So horrifically out of focus here, but you can see how things have changed. And again, what we're doing, we are seeing a delaying tactic occurring here. I am just not moving forward particularly much. These Legionnaires have pulled back so that Canephors can arrive. This is the last unit onto the party, and now we can see kind of like how much force I am dedicating to this push here. The Bone Golems have begun the wheel. These Legionnaires have just made a march charge after so the Knights, the Crimson Tower here, just elected to stay stationary. The Legionnaires march charged into them, and the Varangians have moved up behind. and everything else just continues to posture. I've taken some wounds from a magic attack from the priest. That's fine. I want this fight to be delayed as long as possible because this is more of Thanquil's force than mine. One big thing that happened is the Varangian have moved forward and the Gilded Legion have, I think, gone for a long bomb charge and whiffed it. I think that's something that happened, although it was one of those outside chances. So basically still like some posturing to fight, but nothing has happened yet. Next turn, however, we will begin to get very, very messy. So this is the last picture I've taken because we actually called the game after this because we were both kind of tired and Thankful considered the game basically done. But we can see that decisive action has occurred, and it has ultimately occurred in my favor. So a bunch of different fights happened here, and I am honestly pretty pleased with how I executed all of them. With one small exception, but which I think Thankful played very well around, what has gone on? Let's break this down into the different flanks. So on the right flank, this unit of Crimson Tower has swept around and charged, clashed, and destroyed my Legionnaires. And then the unit of freed up Crimson Tower has now attempted to make a long bomb charge into these Varangians. And they've flubbed it. They needed something like a 5+, maybe a 4+, but they didn't have a banner on the unit because they're sort of like not important to the game plan. And so the Varangians have charged, clashed into them, and just annihilated them. What that means is that on this fight, we now have one unit of full health Varangians versus one unit of full health Crimson Tower. And even if the Crimson Tower get the charge on me, I probably win that fight. Every hit a Varangian causes translates into wounds on the Crimson Tower, lots of wounds on the Crimson Tower, whereas the Crimson Tower are relying on their cleave, on the charge, which the Varangians ignore, their brutal impact, which the Varangians partially ignore, and their terror, which the Varangians ignore. So this pool of 24 wounds is just a little bit too much, even if I don't get the jump on him next turn. On the left flank, I've gone for a 4+ rerollable charge with these Varangians, and I've made a charge, clash, and I have killed, I think, almost 4 stands, and a bit of the Gilded Legion. Now, the Gilded Legion have cracked back, they've used all of their support attacks, but enough of them were lost. That's 12 fewer dice coming back at me, that although the Varangians were kind of bloodied up, they are now in a situation where this fight for them is potentially winnable, or if the Gilded Legion do break through, they will break through with perishingly few things left. In the center, I've made a march charge clash with the Praetorians into the militia. Not killed them, but done enough damage to break them, and then had the Xhiliarch be the immediate activation after that, which means that the Xhiliarch could declare a duel, and in that duel he has just annihilated the Theist Priest, which means he has killed the Theist Priest before the Theist Priest had a chance to either cast a spell or use the Elysium Fragment draw event, which means that when these militia have activated and rallied, they've done so, they've made a clash, and they've just done 0 damage to me. All of the damage to this unit has come from the Ashen Dawn, charging in, but at least I had Bastion up against this, so defense 4. Against their impact attacks, I think that meant I was defense 4, and against their wedge, cleave, clash attacks, only 2 of them are able to engage. One of them is the Priory Commander, one of them is an Ashen Dawn, and so 3 of them were able to engage, and I took a bunch of casualties, but the unit is ultimately functional and intact, and should be able to hold these Ashen Dawn here for some time. Finally, on the sort of like central flank here, I've gone for a march charge with the Canephors into the militia, done some damage, and then the militia have just said like, no, we're leaving because the Ashen Dawn were right up behind the militia bowmen. And so as long as those militia were in combat, the Ashen Dawn were like effectively completely unable to move. So the militia bowmen moved out of melee with a withdraw, failed their withdraw roll, and were completely destroyed, which meant that the Ashen Dawn could make a charge. Now, Canephora are pretty tough, but they're not that tough. I rolled really well on my blessed defense dice rolls. It's against a cleave 2 from the wedge clash attacks. It's something like a 4 in 9 chance to fail a roll against an attack. So it's a 55-ish% chance to succeed. But I took a lot of hits from that unit because this was the Priory Commander Supremacy turn, and all I lost from the entire lot were, I think there's something like 7 wounds total to the Canephors. In a fair world, probably 2 of them would have died. Although that still allows me to do what I did, which is subsequently have the Bone Golems take a charge into the flank and kill one of the Ashen Dawn. Now, the Bone Golems are in the water, but next turn they will be able to reform out of the water, so that like most of the regiment is not in the water. And at that point, this fight is a fight that is very good for the Bone Golems. On even kilter, Bone Golems versus Ashen Dawn, the fight basically comes down to who gets to swing the first punch. Because once you have a big grindy line fighting, the Ashen Dawn defenses hold up quite well against Bone Golems, but the Aura of Death is what begins to tell. Ashen Dawn are one of those units that have just like copiously high resolve, and in that situation, the recent change to Aura of Death, where it inflicts more hits but doesn't cause resolve checks, helps make it an insurance policy against this kind of like Omega brick. And even with Defense 4, if you're lined up like 2 Ashen Dawn versus 4 Bone Golems, that is a lot of that's enough hits from Aura of Death to begin wearing down the Ashen Dawn to the point where they just can't win that fight by the end of basically they can't win that fight. And so this is the point where we call the game, basically in the interest of going and having a sit down and a chat and seeing how everyone else is doing. We have a decisive fight having occurred over here. We have had a decisive fight occurring here, and although these two fights will probably eventually swing in favor of the 100 Kingdoms, it is pretty likely that a bloodied Gilded Legion brick will emerge decisive from this, and pretty likely that the Ashen Dawn will eventually put these Praetorians down. They won't do so in time to stop this force from pushing in this direction. And in any case, right now I am securing this objective here and securing this objective here. What that means is that the score is going to run up. Basically, the score is going to run away with me, and I even have some resources spare to move this Hierodeacon unit up here, and by the end of the game, kill that objective. And if I need to, this Archimandrite unit is in position to sort of like plug some gaps, or even potentially move in this direction to posture against anything that might charge into this objective here. So I have too many resources left. I have sort of too much power left on the board. Once again, the power of all heavies is in play here. Now, Thankwell and I talked about this game after the fact, and after a little bit of mulling over it, he put his finger on a common theme in both of the two matchups that I had played yesterday, and that is basically no range from my opponents in either game, and in particular, no decisive ranged. The poke from the Theist Priest, Heavenly Fire, is an incredible spell. I really, really like it, and on a juiced Theist Priest, it does a lot of damage. But if we think about this list and we cut back on some of the more gratuitous elements, maybe we don't run 2 whole units of Ashen Dawn, and we use those points to get in a few more chaff units to just soak attacks so that the heavy cavalry doesn't have to weather that kind of thing. So that, for example, maybe if an entire militia bowman unit could be dedicated to this flank, that is only 75 points and would have massively swung things over here. But what we are really looking to include in this list is a unit of like 5 longbowmen. Longbowmen are not necessarily the most efficient range unit in the game, but they are pretty good, and they have long range, and they have armor piercing, and they are a very good unit for forcing me to not do what I did. So what I did was I sort of just built this line over here, I let the heavies arrive, I let everything form up, I waited because there was a great deal more 100 Kingdoms force than there was Old Dominion force here, and I waited and waited until the pressure built, and a decisive clash in my favor was able to occur. If Thankwell had had a unit of 5 longbows, like just sitting here shooting into these units, I would not have had the luxury of doing that. Now he would have something had to be removed from his list to accommodate that, but all of a sudden now I have to move forward. I have to start engaging with things, and that makes units like these heavy cavalry, and especially these poor Crimson Tower, an asset instead of a liability. When they are in a position where they can counterstrike, they can take advantage of situations that have emerged, rather than, for example, getting march charged by Legionnaires, the game is a great deal better for them. So in any case, that's the 2 games that we played. I did not get to play the 3rd round. I had to go and lose an auction to a bunch of cashed up boomers. But two games in a day is still a lot of Conquest. I'm really enjoying Conquest. It's been very, very enjoyable, but they are long games to play. It's like, every game is an operatic drama of highs and lows and tension and evolving circumstances. Very, very enjoyable, but it was a lot of game in 2 days. I was able to pop back into the store and see Alex from Goonhammer fielding their Wadroon, running around dinosauring people. I think they went 2-1 by the end of the day. And Thankwell was able to play us a 3rd round, and he went 2-1 by the end of the day as well. So each of us got 2 wins. I think technically I was awarded a bye for the 3rd round by the grace of the TO. But yeah, overall, so a great day of showing for Goonhammer authors, and just overall some really, really good games. I've been working on my Old Dominion color scheme. You can probably see a little bit here, actually, these bone golems and this Archimandrite stand-in, I actually push the contrast on the color enough that it looks a little better on camera when it's not being photographed up close under good light. But yeah, really enjoying it, really enjoying Conquest generally. There will be probably fewer than other game systems battle reports because getting good pictures and actually doing a report for Conquest is a bit of a challenge. But I hope you enjoyed this, and I will, as always, see you next time.